Hello and welcome to your reflexive verb review. So we are going to today talk about mainly focusing on how to conjugate them because that's what you need to know for your quiz, but also kind of going over what exactly is a reflexive verb and how it differs from English. So how do we recognize a reflexive verb? A reflexive verb can be recognized by that reflexive pronoun that you see in front of it. When it's in its infinitive form, it still has the reflexive pronoun and it's in third person. And that's se. So we have verbs like se coucher, se réveiller, s'inquiéter, se laver, se sentir, se lever, se dépêcher, s'endormir, se reposer, se bronzer, s'asseoir, se coucher. And of course, there's so many other ones that you learned in French 3 that aren't listed on here, but that you might know. Also, and you don't need to write these down because we'll be getting a list of these in class, but we have a bunch of course this is not going to work. Well, then we won't worry about it today. We have a ton of new verbs that are going to be on our vocabulary list, which is why we are reviewing reflexive verbs so that way we can use them accurately. So, how do we conjugate a reflexive verb? The verb itself, the infinitive, conjugates like a regular verb. So if it's an ER verb, you're going to tack on all your regular verb endings. If it's an irregular verb, you might just have to memorize that irregular form, or it follows a pattern of other irregular verbs. So where the reflexive verb comes in is that reflexive pronoun, that se that we talked about, has to change so that it agrees with the subject pronoun. So se laver would conjugate to je me lave, tu te laves, il se lave, nous nous lavons, vous vous lavez, and il se lave. One thing to note is that me, te, and se all change to, you drop the e and add an apostrophe when it's in front of a vowel. And other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Notice that the first word you see there in black is the subject pronoun. So je, tu, il, nous, vous, il. Those are subject pronouns. We still have to remember those terms, especially when we start playing around with different structures. So then the reflexive pronoun is what you see there in teal. Me, te, se, nous, vous, se. And don't confuse them either with object pronouns. Even though they're similar, technically they're functioning differently within these sentences. So when you see nous nous lavons, if I were to ask you to circle the subject pronoun, I would expect for you to circle the first one. But if I were to ask you to circle this reflexive pronoun, you would need to do the middle. So it's important you can distinguish the two. Mainly this is because when we do, if I were to get you to write a question using inversion, what happens with inversion? The subject pronoun moves behind the verb. And so you just want to make sure you're getting the right pronoun, even though they're the same. What happens in a negative sentence? We see je ne me lave pas les cheveux. So the ne pas goes around both the reflexive pronoun and the verb. This is where these reflexive pronouns function very similarly to object pronouns. So as far as placement, you should already have that memorized. So here's the conjugation of the passé composé. So a couple of notes that we need to remember is that the reflexive pronoun, once again, has to agree with the subject pronoun. So we're going to change the se to either je me, tu te, il se, nous nous, vous vous, il se. Now, what's different about reflexive verbs is they use être as their helping verb. So remember, être is used for the 17 Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp, and it's used for reflexive verbs. Typically speaking, these reflexive verbs cannot have a direct object. So because we're using être, what does that mean we need to do with the past participle? We also need to make agreement. So that rule still applies. And where does the reflexive pronoun go? The reflexive pronoun goes in front of the helping verb, and that is not a new rule. That is the same rule that we learned with object pronouns. So look at the following examples. Je me suis réveillée. So I'm a girl, so I put an E on mine. Guys, you would not put an E on yours. So notice that we have our subject pronoun, then our reflexive pronoun, our form of être as our helping verb, and then our past participle. And then we do make agreement with that past participle. So another example, nous nous sommes dépêchés. And so of course we make agreement with dépêché, putting an S on nous. What happens when we want to make the sentence negative? So this rule is not a new rule. Where does the ne pas go? It goes around the helping verb. And of course it is with that reflexive pronoun as well. Il ne s'est pas rasé. Notice this next example has an asterisk next to it because it is special. We see elle s'est lavé les mains. And I've kind of highlighted or pointed out to you that notice that there is no agreement on this. So typically speaking, you should be making agreement. The only time you do not make agreement in the passé composé is when you specify a body part. So notice that we're not saying that she just is washing, or she washed rather, but rather we're saying she washed her hands. And because we've specified that body part, we would take away the agreement that should be on there, because in theory we have a direct object. Okay, so make sure you copy down a couple of those examples. Another tense that we talked about is the imperative. Okay, in a negative command, sentence order is normal. And don't forget that you need to drop the S off the to form of your ER verbs. That's a rule from French 2, just on how to form the imperative. It has nothing to do with reflexives. Okay, so we would see ne t'habillez pas, ne vous regardez pas dans la glace, ne vous inquiétez pas, don't worry. So everything is normal. Notice that we dropped the subject pronoun. Okay, but we kept the reflexive pronoun because that's how you form a command. You drop the subject pronoun. And the placement is just like object pronouns. So this rule is not new. So what happens in an affirmative command? This is the same thing with object pronouns. The reflexive pronoun is going to move behind the verb. So we would say amuse-toi, have fun. Reposons-nous, let's relax. Dépêchez-vous, hurry up. Now, don't confuse this with inversion. Oftentimes, students want to start throwing reflexive pronouns on the end of everything, and then that turns it into a question with inversion. So you only use a pronoun on the end of the verb like this as a command if it's a reflexive verb. In theory, we dropped that subject pronoun. So the pronoun that you see there, that dépêchez-vous, that's not a question. That's a command to hurry up. If it was a question, there would be another pronoun in there. It would be vous dépêchez-vous. Okay, and so if that seems confusing, I can show you a couple of examples in class. You can take a moment and copy this chart. What it does is it's just gone through and done the je form. It's almost like a verb synopsis. I switched the to for the imperative because you can't give yourself a command. So for example, it gives you le présent, le futur simple, le condition, l'imparfait, and you can see all of those examples. All of those is when there's just one verb form. And then of course on the right hand side is the negative. But then we have the passé composé. So we see je me suis amusé, and then the negative, je ne me suis pas amusé. One thing that we didn't cover, but you still, like on a whole separate slide, is look where we see verb plus infinitive. So for example, like le futur proche, notice that the reflexive pronoun still goes in front of the infinitive. So, and that's a rule that we learned with object pronouns. When you have a verb plus infinitive, the pronoun goes in front of the infinitive. But what you also have to remember is that that reflexive pronoun should still agree with the subject, even though you're not conjugating amuser. Because I am going to have fun myself, right? And someone else isn't going to have fun for me. Okay. And then, of course, you can see the imperative, amuse-toi, ne t'amuse pas. Okay, have fun, don't have fun. And then inversion, I just did inversion with the present tense. You can see how it works with the passé composé. It gets a little bit tricky. And I think we do maybe a little bit of practice with that. But notice that when we see t'amuse-tu, this is important. This is where I keep saying it's important you can distinguish between your pronouns. This te that comes in front is the reflexive pronoun. What happens with inversion is that the subject pronoun moves behind. So t'amuse-tu? That's a question. Amuse-toi, that's the reflexive pronoun. So you can see the difference. So I recommend that you copy the chart just so you can kind of see a verb synopsis is great to kind of compare between your tenses and see them. So that was all about conjugating. And so I want you to see a couple of these uses. This is kind of like what a reflexive verb is and how it is used in French. So the first reason that we have a reflexive verb is just that, reflexive. The idea is that the subject is both performing and receiving the action. So the subject performs the action on or for itself. So for example, if you look over to the right, you see some examples. We see je me couche. The verb coucher means to put to bed. So when I say je me couche, I am putting to bed. and I'm putting myself to bed. So we typically use reflexives in English by putting the word myself or herself or hisself. We just don't use that in English. We use this reflexive, in French we use this reflexive pronoun. Because I can also put someone else to bed. I can put my child to bed. Je couche le bébé. So you see in the first example, we would use it reflexively to imply that I am both performing the subject, I'm performing the action, and I'm performing it for or on myself. But another use for reflexive verbs is to express that the action is reciprocal. So when the action is being reciprocated between two people. So if you look to the right for number 2, we see nous nous parlons. It's not that we are each talking to ourselves, but rather that we are talking to each other. And the third use, which I've implied before, is that the passive voice, you can make a verb reflexive to render the passive voice more active. So if you look at the third example, we see la soupe s'est faite. And so it says the soup made. And if we were to translate it literally, we would say the soup made itself. And of course, we know that's impossible. A soup doesn't make itself. So rather, the idea is saying the soup was made. And since we don't know who made the soup, this at least keeps the soup as the subject of the sentence rather than the direct object, or saying the soup was made with a past participle, which is something to be avoided. So I'm not sure if I will be able to show you these notes because it seems like the smart board is being a little irritating. So I'm going to tell you what they are, and I apologize because I had examples. So this first note was that sometimes a verb can be reflexive or not reflexive depending on the context. And this is just like that verb se coucher with the baby. So I think another verb is regarder. I can watch TV and say je regarde la télé. Notice that I'm the subject and the direct object is the TV. But I can look at myself in the mirror and now the verb is reflexive. Okay? And I would say je me regarde. So I am looking at myself. So the verb can change. Sometimes it can be reflexive. And sometimes it's not reflexive, depending on the context. The second note you need to make is sometimes making a verb reflexive, changing its meaning altogether. So we have the verb, I don't know if I can type this for you, entendre. There we go. Entendre, if you remember, means to hear. Okay? We're going to learn a new vocabulary word, which is s'entendre. And if we were to translate that literally, we might think it means to hear, like to hear yourself or to hear each other if we're looking at it reflexively. And that's actually kind of the word picture because s'entendre actually means to get along. So the idea is that you hear each other, you get along. So the meaning changes completely. Another one is attendre, which means to wait or to wait for. And when the verb is made reflexive, the meaning changes to expect. So sometimes that reflexive pronoun does completely change the meaning. And the third note that you need to make is that sometimes the verb is reflexive in French when it doesn't really make sense in English. So for example, the verb se sentir, it means to feel. That would never be reflexive in English. So if you try to think about the subject both performing and receiving the action and you're using English, it's not going to make sense. So the bottom line is you just have to memorize which verbs are reflexive sometimes. Okay? Okay, so make sure you do the practice that I gave you in class. There's 2 grammar handouts, and then you're doing the 2 exercises in the workbook. Bring any questions that you have from this presentation tomorrow to class, so that way we can cover them before your grammar quiz. Okay. Au revoir.